Welcome to the IVM Podcast Network.
Hey, welcome to Shunya One. I'm your host Shiladitya. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm the founder of Wrestling Technologies and Hipcask. And I'm joined here in the studio with my co-host Amit Doshi, the CEO of Indus Vox Media.
That's correct.
And that brings you this awesome podcast and a whole bunch of others.
Many others.
Where can we find you on Twitter?
Doshi Amit on Twitter.
All right, great. I'm at Shiladitya, and I have with me a special guest, someone actually who's a batchmate of mine from college, and candidly my senior as well.
Thank you. I was going to make that correction.
But obviously a long-time friend, but someone who we're going to talk to about some really interesting stuff. Abhijeet Ramesh, welcome to the show. Abhijeet is the Senior Director of Digital Solutions at Visa for India and South Asia. Let's just start with that. I mean, we just know Visa as a logo on our credit cards. So what exactly do you do there, what you've been doing there for a while now, I know. And introduce yourself a bit. Where can people find you to reach out to you?
Yeah, hi. Happy to be here. So let's start with Visa. Visa essentially is a very large payments network. What that means is that we process hundreds and millions of transactions every year around the world, which is basically every time your card gets swiped on a terminal, or you use it online to make a payment, or on your mobile phone to make a payment. We are the guys who make that transaction travel across banks, across boundaries of countries, and make sure that it goes through, and eventually make sure it's cleared and settled. So we are a payment network, and what we also are is a framework that allows for that transaction to happen, which basically means that every time, Shiladitya, you see the Visa mark on your card, and then you see a Visa mark outside a merchant location, you're guaranteed that your card's going to be accepted there and it's going to work. You're also guaranteed that if for whatever reason you don't get what you've bought when you say order something online, that you can get your money back.
Is that you guys? I mean, you guys get to are gatekeepers of that, or is it my bank?
We're actually the people who provide the platform to make sure that happens, and the framework, like I said. So if you order a T-shirt online and for whatever reason it had a sleeve missing, you could go back to the merchant and that you bought it from and say there's a sleeve missing, and maybe they'll replace it for you, maybe they won't. If they don't, you could call your bank, and then your bank, through us, would raise what is called a chargeback, which would go to the merchant's bank, and if it is indeed something that the merchant shouldn't have done, like ship you a T-shirt with a sleeve missing, the merchant is required to refund the money to you. And our platform and the processes that we defined around how this whole thing should happen make sure that happens, which is why, yes, we are responsible for that brand promise.
Interesting, because it sounds like it's a really painful and long process. I haven't done it personally, have you? I mean, I've not done a chargeback. I mean, I've not executed or asked for one, but clearly it happens. And that's why
I've had merchant-initiated refunds, right? But I don't think I've ever asked for a chargeback per se.
So yeah, if you,
but I guess the same mechanism, right?
Not a lot of people know about this, and especially consumers. There is low awareness, and I guess when a dispute is raised, it gets handled through this method. There are also a lot of other kinds of disputes that consumers raise. I was debited twice, duplicate processing.
Right.
Yeah.
And that is also handled through our network. So there is all of these things that the Visa mark means to a consumer. Universal acceptance, certain guarantees. It also means certain things to the merchant. For the merchant, it means that when the card is swiped and then they get that confirmation that they'll get paid and they hand over the goods to you, it means that they will get paid in whatever the next settlement cycle is.
Right.
There is again a promise in the fact that they accept a Visa card in the brand itself. that is made to the merchant.
So that's a Visa guarantee rather than a bank guarantee? I thought that payment, that they would get their payment on time, was something that
I think
occurred
that's
from the bank.
exactly the kind of... I understand what you're trying to say, but again, as far as a consumer or a merchant is concerned, typically we always think of the bank first, right? I mean, you know, although it's your logo on there, and your brand is a lot more visible and your brand is a lot more prominent, but we typically just think that, hey, the bank's responsible.
Right,
And
yeah.
is that on purpose? Is that a structure?
It is. So we will typically never have a direct relationship with
I don't
the
have a Visa
cardholder
account.
or with the merchant, right?
Yeah.
We would be the guys who would sit between the two banks, the bank that gave you the card,
Right.
and the bank as a consumer, and the bank that gave the terminal to the merchant. So we would be the guys who would sit between them
Right.
and facilitate all of this. But the primary consumer cardholder relationship and the merchant relationship, that's held and managed by the banks.
Yeah. So it's ultimately the bank who...
But
so
the
you're
bank-
just actually that makes you a real solidly a tech company, right?
You're right. So we are at our heart a tech company. Like I said, a very large network.
Right.
But along with that, we are also a brand, which means certain things to certain people.
Correct.
If you're a merchant, it means
Right.
something to you. If you're a consumer, it means something to you.
What do you think? The fact that obviously there's a Visa, there's the other guys, although we can talk about them. But the point being, how come just these so many? I mean, and there aren't too many. Like what? How did it become so big that no one really started and said, let's make one more? Like why can't?
think people
Why are you?
started,
How
right?
come you guys not be disrupted?
You're right. Anyone can get disrupted, and that is in the largest part what I do. So to answer your earlier question in terms of what my job is at Visa. So I belong to the products organization, and within the products organization we have what we call core products, which are your traditional credit cards, debit cards, prepaid. We also have a different suite of products called commercial cards targeted at large market corporates and SMEs. And then there is what our group does, my group does, which is essentially everything outside of these core products and everything that helps build layers of value on these core products. To give you some examples, how can you take a debit card which was meant to be used in the face-to-face environment and take it online to be used for e-commerce, put it into a mobile phone, so it could be used for an in-app payment, get that card to be tapped at a terminal rather than dipped, get that card to be provisioned into a mobile device, and the mobile device itself gets tapped at a terminal. And as we look ahead, how can that card sit in your refrigerator as we start talking about the Internet of Things, and then your refrigerator itself has to make a payment.
Right.
Really? My refrigerator is going to walk to the store and make a payment. That's an interesting image. No, but I totally get what you're saying.
Connected home, right?
No,
I mean, that's
the whole point, I think, by the way, I have been waiting for all this to happen.
Of course, yeah.
I think I'm the first person to say that things aren't happening fast enough
Yep.
in this space. And that way, I think our market, although it's been more aggressive compared to the US or other markets in terms of, the security aspect, we have been lacking on the, you can say, deployment of all these innovations, right? I mean, I've been waiting forever for QR codes, NFC, all of this to take off. Finally it is, and thanks to you guys. But what's the roadmap like? I mean, all this, like the stuff which you just mentioned, is all this already happening in the world, and like, is it being really adopted? Do people really want this? What's your take on it? What needs to happen here?
So there are two questions there, and let me try and answer them one after the other. The first is, all of these things, why is it taking it so long for these things to start happening? So, even as we think about all of these cool experiences that essentially bring convenience to the cardholder, we need to at all times be, conscious in terms of how we balance that with security. As being the people who provide this framework in which cardholders, merchants, banks operate, we need to, we do have a large role to play in maintaining that balance. And typically, if while you're operating in a particular frame of reference, these are inversely correlation. They have an inverse correlation. So,
Right.
You could ask a guy to put in 3 passwords and make it like very, very secure, but then
There's
convenience
no
goes out of the
right.
window, right? However, there is one thing that sort of pretty much shifts the frame of reference, and that's technology. So, as technology evolves, you can think about bringing greater convenience while also offering the same levels of security. Let me give an example of that, right? So I just mentioned that you could, provision your card, which basically means, put your card credentials into a phone and, start tapping it to make payments. This has taken a while to happen, and the reason for that is as you put your card credentials onto a phone, it then gets exposed to a lot of other things that are happening in your phone.
Right.
Malware and to prevent that, how technology evolved is that there's this concept of tokenization that was created. So now what happens when you're sort of saving your card in your phone to make a payment is almost as soon as you put your card credentials into the phone, the card credentials go and sort of sit on the Visa systems, and they get swapped out for another card credential which looks exactly the same and is saved on your phone, but is such that it can be used only on that phone.
Right.
It's
right?
encrypted with that phone.
It's what we call domain restricted. It can be used only on that device. Further, it can also be channel restricted to say that this can only be used in face-to-face environments when you tap the phone.
Right.
What that has done is that has brought the risk level of that transaction down significantly, and thus allowed us to create this newer form of convenience for the cardholder to come and make a payment without necessarily carrying their wallet to the store.
That's also because the merchant systems needed that, right? I mean, this is a already well-defined tokenization, like you said, is a well-defined way of doing a transaction.
It wasn't until recently, and the way this process that I described, which is by the way how Apple Pay, Samsung Pay, and Android Pay and the others work. When it was created, it was created keeping in mind the fact that it's much harder to go and change the complete merchant ecosystem and change all the terminals to support this very sophisticated way of handling security. And therefore, to answer your point, it did not require a lot of work at the terminal. If it was already ready to accept a payment by tapping a card, you could just start tapping a phone now.
Yeah.
So that's an example of how the balance in security and convenience can be maintained, sort of in a new frame of reference that's created because technology has evolved.
Right.
That's to answer your first question. It has taken time because technology needed to evolve. It has now reached a stage where a lot of solutions can be very cloud dependent because internet connectivity is that much faster. A lot more smartphones now, for example, have NFC controllers, have better processors, can have sophisticated authentication like biometrics. So
Right.
all of this is technology that has made it possible. Coming to your second question, what are the really cool things that are happening in
Going
payments?
forward,
Let's talk a little bit about what's happening globally, and then we can talk a little bit about what's happening in India in terms of the newest and coolest trends. So there is quite a few. I'll just pick a couple that are the most interesting. So the first is this, right? Commerce is shifting away from plastic to devices, and that started with the smartphone, has started going into wearables, watches, and is expected to now go into devices, which is, for example, your refrigerator, your car,
Amazon Echoes,
absolutely. So there is a lot of, as more and more devices get connected to the internet, there is a lot more places where payment credentials could reside. And this, by the way, also, uses the tokenization platforms that I just talked about, because the statistic is that there'll be about 50 billion devices connected to the internet by 2022, I think, depending on what report you're reading. And it's nightmarish if you have to start thinking that all of these will start storing real card credentials.
Right.
So tokens will be what will get stored on all of these devices. So that's one big trend we are seeing, that plastic is going to start becoming less relevant, and it will exist in virtual forms on devices. The other big trend we are seeing is that pretty much everyone who's anyone is now interested in payments. So phone manufacturers like Apple or Samsung or LG, to large technology players, Google, to a large e-com giant like Amazon, everyone is out there building out a pay of their own, right? An Amazon Pay, a Samsung Pay, an Android Pay.
Aren't they on some basis? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No.
Aren't they sitting on your back when they do this? I mean, aren't you the connection to the bank account? I mean, essentially at the end of the day.
You're right, and that's how our role is evolving, and that's again a large part of what we do in the digital solutions group, which is how do you bring on these new players who are essentially enablers,
right,
and creating newer commerce experiences. How do you bring them on to the network?
Which already exists.
Right. But again is beyond just the technology, is also a framework, like we were saying.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So now, there are so many people, for example, when you're paying with your mobile phone, there are so many people who have a relationship with the cardholder of some sort, right? Typically it was the bank that gave you the card and maybe the merchant. But now there is also suddenly, the handset manufacturer,
right,
where you sort of saved your card and you could be calling them, and then, how do they know how to respond to your questions? So as the ecosystem evolves and gets sophisticated, this sort of framework needs to evolve and continue to be sophisticated to manage this evolution. So that's another trend. A lot of new players are entering the payment ecosystem, and one of the reasons they're doing this, our belief, is that commerce is just so integral to what a person does every day. That for them to sit out makes them sort of feel incomplete. So, for example, you're using a device, and if you want to buy music on the phone, someone who's trying to, go beyond just selling you the device, along with that also sell you a platform to listen to music, would also want to be at that last leg,
right,
to also,
handle the transaction,
handle the payment transaction.
Yeah.
Similarly, a large e-commerce merchant would also, want to be as involved in the payment itself. So
it's all about, you can say, again, better user experience, right? I mean,
it's actually all about engagement, right? You want to have as much engagement as possible with the user.
Correct.
And that's why a lot of players are getting involved or sort of entering the payment ecosystem. The other big thing that's happening is there is this concept of the shared economy that's also building up.
The sharing economy in general,
yeah, exactly. So
the Airbnbs,
Airbnb, Uber, not in India but elsewhere, right? You could have a cab and have a car and just turn on a switch on your app and you could become a driver.
Yeah.
And what is happening as a result is that people are not necessarily going to be paying only merchants but also each other.
Right.
And therefore commerce, we expect, will extend very, very quickly beyond being P2M or person to merchant to also being person to person.
Starting to be.
It's already starting to be, right? So that's another big trend that we are seeing. Another big trend that we are seeing is sort of the lines between what was traditionally called face-to-face commerce, which is like a physical merchant where you went and swiped your card, dipped it or tapped it, and what we called a card not present merchant or an online merchant where you actually entered 16-digit card, a 16-digit card number with expiry and CVV. So these are crossing over each other, and Uber is a classic example, right? You're across, so you're sitting in the cab, pretty much across the counter with the merchant in that case. Yet the real transaction that's happening is what is traditionally been called as a card not present transaction.
Right.
So that line will start blurring very, very quickly, and that also has to do in part with the fact that plastic in its physical manifestation is also going to start, disappearing.
So how do wallets kind of apply to this particular stuff, right? Because wallets are similar.
One more intermediary, right? They're one more layer.
I guess so.
And now they're a bank as well. So.
They are. Yeah.
So there are a few definitions of wallets. The two that are most broadly used are a wallet as a store of value itself, and then a wallet as a store of payment instruments. Wallet as a store of value is sort of an alternative to using cards.
Right.
And yeah, you're right, they're evolving and they are creating a different set of experiences.
Which a traditional bank had.
So I was thinking about this from you were talking about P2M versus P2P, right?
Yeah.
So I know that in the last couple of months, doing transfers through Paytm has become extremely common for a lot of people.
Yep.
And so, I mean, like, how does that affect what you were talking about, right? In the sense of how Visa is affected by that kind of this.
I'll talk a little bit from the cards ecosystem perspective versus the wallet perspective. You're right. What has started happening with Paytm is that people are paying each other a lot, and oftentimes the person receiving the money is actually a small merchant. Mm-hmm. And in the cards world, what has been happening is that the whole notion of a merchant accepting a payment has been hinged greatly around having a point of sale terminal in the physical
machine.
environment, the card machine. Yeah. And that has to a great extent restricted how deep you can go when you want to, sign up merchants.
Right.
You can't go beyond a point because there is capex involved, there is opex involved, there is service involved. Mm-hmm. So typically a merchant needs to be of a particular size
to afford that machine, basically,
or to be viable for the bank to sign up and give that machine to. An interesting alternate that we worked on, we called it M-Visa when we launched it, is we said, can we take away the terminal from this whole equation and replace it with something that's very asset light, a QR code maybe. And that is a way of then, going into the long tail of merchants, as we call it. So we put it out there, and then, that evolved into what is now called Bharat QR, which is sort of a common standard for QR-based payments across payment networks. So you're right, that the reason why traditional electronic payments have not grown into small merchant segments has been the cost of a terminal and making it viable. QR is one way, as an example, that the card ecosystem, payments ecosystem, is sort of trying to bridge that gap.
I was also thinking even from like a person-to-person basis, right? I mean, like we go out for dinner. I pay with my credit card. He owes me $1,000. He wants to give me the cash immediately. It's easy to kind of do that transfer through Paytm right now. So this, but at the same time, that is an added layer on top because you put money into Paytm through your Visa card. And I mean, like, that's just kind of this. So, if there is that part of any kind of future plan in terms of like being able to facilitate this kind of person to person thing?
Directly, you mean? Yeah. Like, can I just pay your card directly from my card?
So there is a way to do, card-to-card payments.
Some apps do it.
Yeah.
Some apps do it. Facebook Messenger in the US does it.
Okay.
There are quite a few examples.
Okay.
We are working on a few projects here in India as well. So yeah, it's absolutely doable because at the end of the day, it's money moving from one account to another
account. Exactly. You guys have
and
all the infrastructure for that, right? I mean, like to kind of manage that stuff. That's why I was just wondering about that.
And it can be a lot more instant. I mean, even today, when P2M merchant doesn't get his money immediately.
Yeah.
Whereas in person to person, typically the premise is that I want my money immediately and hence I'm paying you. Yeah. I mean, it's not about a settlement. Like, I'm not a business which will have a regular settlement.
So when it happens card to card, that's possible.
Exactly. Okay. So, which is why I think that's a fundamental difference also between the expectations of P2P versus P2M, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if I'm getting paid infrequently, I mean, when someone pays me directly, it's probably not as frequent. So I need my money immediately. So I think that's also where a platform like yours can play a role. But I want to talk a bit more about the hindrances and roadblocks. But I think we're going to take a break and come back and talk some more on that.
Hi, I'm May, and I'm a huge fan of the indie music scene in our country. A scene that's relatively underground, even though it sometimes speaks its head overground, but there's no shortage of talent, and I get the privilege of interviewing some of the most awesome musicians on my show. I've had the likes of Euphoria, Krish Kale, Hardcore, Randolph Correa. I've had singer-songwriters, folk singers, electronic music producers, playback singers, rappers, fusion artists, instrumentalists, classical musicians, and so on. Whether mainstream or not, these people have chosen to release their original music, and these are the people currently shaping the direction in which our music scene is heading. Join me on my show every Monday and tune in to discover the unique talent coming out of India today. You can catch Made in India on your favorite podcasting app or our very own IVM podcast app.
Hey, welcome back. So, Abhijeet, I know we've been talking in detail about payments, and it's been a great, I think, eye-opener in terms of all the tech which is actually around in payments. I mean, being a payments geek, I actually enjoy talking about this stuff, and I really cannot wait until my refrigerator can actually do payments on my behalf.
Apparently, being a payments geek is a thing.
I don't know, man. I just say that on my Twitter bio. But anyway, so this is really cool stuff, right? And again, my earlier question was, how come it's taken time? But in particular, since we are sitting here in India, I want to ask you, how long has it taken India? Why do still a lot of things which have existed in the West and have got rapid adoption once it started in the country, the same doesn't seem to happen here? I mean, we still say cash is king. We still, even though we have a lot of plastic out there, we are already seeing QR also. So what's happening here? What's your take on the scene here?
So payments is we call it a two-sided business. There is what is happening with consumers, the payers, and then what's happening on the merchant side. So let's talk about what's happening on the consumer side first. India, by the way, has the largest basis of cards. We have about 900 million cards thereabouts, if you look at the latest RBI report, across all the networks. But 850 million of those are debit.
Okay.
And about 50 million are credit. A majority of the 850 million, nearly 90%, and before demonetization happened, a higher number than that as well,
were never used.
Were never used, or were used only to withdraw cash from the ATM.
Right.
Yeah.
And then go and pay your merchant. There were two reasons for that. One is the larger issue of awareness. Mm-hmm. A country our size, both in terms of number of people and the geographic spread, and sort of how deep, in terms of tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 you need to go to create awareness, it's not easy. Driving behavior change is not easy, and it's not just true of payments, it's true of pretty much everything.
Right. Yeah.
It's going to cost a lot of money, and it's going to take a lot of time. So that's the first thing. So it's very inherent, it's very structural. The other thing is that for the few people who are willing to pay with their cards, there isn't enough opportunity for them to use their card for payment, which basically goes back to there aren't enough merchants accepting.
If you have to carry cash, you might as well use it.
And also if you have to carry cash to pay your kirana wala and your dhobi,
you'll use it at a restaurant as well. You have it, you'll use it.
Probably.
No, I mean, basically, if 8 out of 10 positions need cash, payment interactions need cash, then you'll do it for the.
So that's another sort of structural issue, which is there's not been enough opportunity for people to use cards around them. Electronic payment acceptance until recently has been very, very concentrated in what we call the sweet spot for payments, and I'm saying mostly face-to-face, which is organized retail and large ticket payments. Mm-hmm. So that's where cards have predominantly been used, at least in the face-to-face environment. Which brings us to the merchant side. Why isn't there enough coverage? There are a few reasons which are related to cost. We talked about them, right? You can't give a terminal to a really small merchant. Some of that is being cracked, using technology. QR is an example. But there are other reasons. Merchants love cash. It's to not book income, in their accounts is just something they do. And as a result, even if a merchant were large enough to be given a terminal, very often they would not want to accept a payment electronically.
I know they're not allowed to, but you still get if you want to use your credit card, I'm going to charge you 2% more. You still get that.
Yes. So then there is that. There are merchants who value cash, because this is what it comes down to, right? It comes down to, can you value
every single rupee which I'm supposed to
actually even more? Can you put a value on the fact that you don't have to handle cash, you do not have to store it in a locker and then have your guy go and deposit it in a bank and then risk pilferage and all the cost. There is cost involved to cash,
using
right?
cash,
to using cash and
but
handling.
They don't see that.
That value does not work out to what they may have to pay the bank.
Right.
That, and also there are other reasons why they don't want to do it electronically. You combine both, and you find that merchants don't value accepting payments electronically enough. And what is needed to change that is a large structural change, which is demonetization, for as an example, right? There needs to be this large external force that sort of
forces both sides.
Yeah, exactly. Leaves people with no choice but to transact electronically, and then they will start doing it. And we've seen this happen in other smaller forms in other countries. Korea as an example, where the government started incentivizing electronic payments. So if you made a payment electronically, you would get certain benefits, and you accepted a payment electronically, you would get some benefits.
They gave you cash back.
Yeah,
that's what the government wants to do.
Oh, really?
Somewhat, yeah. So it's not cash back, but there is a benefit involved.
Okay.
It's in the form of tax breaks typically.
Okay.
So
that's what the government should do anyway.
They attempted that they actually did it, not just attempted it during demonetization, and they're looking at evolving that further. So that kind of real structural change is needed to drive some of these really big changes that will help us drive both the awareness and the adoption of electronic payments.
Yeah, because right now also, like what you just said, right? People who can accept electronic payments still prefer not to, because there's this notion that I'm losing some money here.
Yeah. So I'm losing some money. Also, I have to declare everything.
Oh yeah, the legal aspect apart. I'm saying, like, the illegal aspect apart. There is still this inherent apprehension.
No, there
towards,
is. So my mom goes shopping when we have relatives coming down from the US. So they go to all these like sari stores and stuff like that. All of those places, pay cash or we'll charge you extra.
Yeah,
that's just how they work.
Exactly. So I think that's a big sensitization, which hopefully all these otherwise painful processes will happen. But this brings me to my another aspect I wanted to talk about. Since you guys are obviously the platform which is handling all of this electronic money movement, and there is the security aspect which we just spoke about. And in general, I think the one more angle of this awareness was of those 850 million debit card holders was that, hey, if I use my card somewhere, it could be stolen, my credentials could be copied, or there could be fraud. Basically, no one I know until very recently, I'm sure our parents and our generation or a lot of previous generation didn't even want to enter details on an e-commerce website.
Of course not.
Saying that, no, why will I type it there? It's not secure. So how big is that threat really? I mean, I know fraud is big and financial fraud is obviously a huge thing, but even today's day and age, like, how big is it really in India, and how come it's still a thing? Like, we all want more convenience, right? We want more convenience, but we're not getting it. And is this a big reason why?
There is an awareness question here as well, but there is
what's the reality?
Apprehension question also. And I think the awareness is also the apprehension, and I'll just tell you how. So you're right. Most people are a little wary of, entering their card credentials into a merchant website. And actually, before the Reserve Bank of India sort of mandated what is called as two-factor authentication, which is in addition to your card credentials, you also put in a password. It's either static or it's dynamic
or whatever,
in the form of an OTP.
Man, 2FA is like this biggest problem on the planet.
So before we go there, let's just talk about what it did for e-commerce, right? So when 2FA happened, the two-factor authentication mandate came about in 2009. That's when a lot of segments started getting opened up for e-commerce in general. If you see, that's about when IRCTC first started scaling up. That's about when all the other travel aggregators started doing well. The category that followed was utility payments, mobile phone payments, and insurance. And then the category that followed was e-tailing. And then now you see a lot of new emerging categories like hyperlocal. Just in terms of statistic, right, until demonetization happened, from nearly no e-commerce payments happening on cards, more than half the transactions that were being done on cards, roughly, were actually e-commerce. So two-factor authentication, therefore, because it took care of apprehension in the consumer's mind, helped e-commerce grow in the country. So it was, to that extent, a great thing that happened.
Great for SMS people.
Yeah. Well, it was great. What has not happened very effectively since is the thing we talked about earlier. Technology may not have been used to sort of, again, shift the frame of reference to continue to provide that security.
And make it convenient.
and continue for it to be convenient. And there are things that are being worked on here and elsewhere that will solve for that. For example, the biometric authentication on your phone, that makes sure the transaction is secure and authenticated while you still don't have to wait for your OTP to be delivered.
Right.
So when that happens is when the convenience sort of starts increasing, building up. But until then, you're right, there is going to be some friction, but not as much for evolved users like you, Shila, payment geek as you call yourself. But for the new people who are coming into the fold of e-commerce every day, experiencing the internet for the first time on their mobile devices, and then that graduates into them, making a payment like a 50 rupee recharge. For all of those people, putting in that OTP in addition to their card credentials gives them a sense of security that sort of brings them onto, into this world of online payments. So there is good things that two-factor authentication has brought for e-commerce in general. There is definitely friction that needs to be removed from that experience. And again, that's another area where we've been spending a lot of our time on, and hopefully we'll have some interesting stuff coming out very soon.
The thing that drives me insane about the fact that you need two-factor on everything is it kills subscription services in this country.
Yeah.
You can't really do subscriptions effectively of any sort. And that I feel is like, it's such a... It doesn't, that...
Yeah, and it's a kind of commerce which is getting more popular.
Yeah, it is. It's one of the most popular. And again, I'm sorry, the podcast business. So, for me, it's even more of a thing because traditionally, the first companies to come on board podcast as advertisers are subscription companies. And so when they don't exist in India, it's a little aggravating.
So you're right. There is stuff that's being worked on. There is a regulatory question here.
That's the...
And I can't speak to that. And therefore can't speak to what's happening. But yes, you're absolutely right. Subscription services, right from, Google AdWords
Everything.
to, advertising on Facebook to Hotstar subscription.
Book of the month clubs. All these
anything
kind of
which
things.
is a regular payment. Yeah.
Also, all of these are growing.
Yeah.
There are a few other categories, which are also very, very well suited for what we call recurring payments, bill payments.
Yeah.
Example, insurance premium payments. Yeah. So you're right. This segment is large. Again, there is regulatory consideration here, so I won't comment. But it's been acknowledged and it's being worked on by a few people. Hopefully, things will change in the near future.
So just sorry, Shiladitya's original question: how big a problem is fraud in India? Right?
Back to that. Even in spite of 2FA.
Yeah.
Actually, thanks to 2FA, both in the e-commerce environment and in the face-to-face environment, it is at one of the lowest levels in the world.
Okay.
It is almost negligible when 2FA actually happens. There are other forms of fraud in India which are more prevalent, and those are in the form of phishing and vishing,
correct,
which go back to awareness, right? So you have people calling you and saying, what was the last transaction? I'm calling from your bank. What was the last transaction you did? And they said, oh, by the way, you've qualified to win a prize for this transaction. Can you give me your card credentials? Yeah. Oh, by the way, we are sending you an OTP. Can you give that to us? And so it goes back to awareness.
Right.
So that is more prevalent and needs to be addressed.
Okay.
And I think there's work being done on that. But again, awareness takes time. Right. So, but otherwise, transactional fraud, one of the lowest in the world.
Interesting. So how big a problem is false positives in this? Because that's something that I deal with on a regular basis. One of the merchants who we work with, every time they charge me, and they charge me every month, they come up as a fraudulent website. So I have to call the bank, tell them that expect a charge from this person, and then for 3 days they'll open it up to that particular. So is this
an international merchant?
It's an international merchant.
That's probably why it's happening. So where two-factor authentication has happened, another benefit of two-factor authentication, there is rarely ever a question of false positives.
Okay.
Because everyone is fairly confident that the holder of the card has gone in and put in an OTP which came to his or her device.
Right.
Or a password which is static and they remembered and they put it in. but where 2FA is not involved,
Right.
that's when a lot of these risk sort of triggers start getting tripped on.
Okay.
Risk rules start getting tripped on. So there will be false positives.
Okay. But it's not a real issue. It's just an issue that I am dealing with myself, but it's not an issue
which will primarily be for cross-border and not
Right.
for domestic. Also, within cross-border, there are certain merchant segments which are
So they're getting whitelisted, I guess.
exactly. These are learning
the
systems,
edge
right?
cases.
They're
Right,
scoring a
right.
transaction and deciding that decline this or call the card holder, call it a referral. So yes, this is more cross-border and more in categories where transactions are not that high, which means learning systems are not as evolved.
Yeah, that's probably true. I doubt there are that many people playing podcast hosts in India.
Exactly.
Exactly, right? So these are the kind of things which obviously the payment space is hot about. I mean, apart from the larger, I know we didn't digress into fintech and all the other crazy stuff happening in fintech, but payments has been the sort of fundamental crux which has to evolve or is evolving fast enough to enable all the other stuff, right? So I actually want to ask you about, again, since we're talking, we talk about entrepreneurship and startups here as well. What's taken the big companies of the world to sort of jump into India and take over the market in the pure payment space compared to, let's say, like Amazon is big here now. And there are other large global players who are getting big in their respective categories. So beyond regulation, I know regulation has been one thing. And so if not jumping in themselves, even you guys, how does Visa intend to work with, let's say, startups and entrepreneurs, and what you guys already do? Is there a chance for us to work with you guys? And likewise with other large global payments players, like what's the roadmap for them?
So I can definitely speak for what we're doing at Visa. There is definitely an intent to bring in smaller developers, fintech companies to work with us. One of the things we are doing, we call it opening the edges of VisaNet, is essentially we've created an abstraction layer around our network, and we are exposing services now or APIs. We sort of also packaged it into a developer portal where we make these APIs available for people to come and look at. There are sandboxes for you to do testing. There is one thing to note, however. Payments is regulated. Payments is also one of those areas where there is a lot of security related overhead.
Okay.
And which does not necessarily make it very easy for smaller companies to come and start playing in this space very naturally.
Right.
That, and also the fact that the way this system is, we call it the four-party model. There's a card holder, there's a bank that gave him the card, there's a merchant, there's a bank that gave the merchant the terminal, and these are the four parties. The four-party model hinges on two banks being involved always. So a fintech that wants to come and play in this space needs to do two things. Needs to be sophisticated enough to handle the level of security that is expected, A, and B, have a way of working
with all the banks.
With a bank,
A bank or more than one bank.
More than one
banks,
bank. There are some banks that are more forward in this regard. Right. There are others who are conservative. But these are the two reasons why you don't see a lot of startup activity spiking like it has in a lot of other fintech spaces, alternate lending. There's a few other spaces which have sort of seen a lot of activity. Payments has not as much, although there is a lot of interest. Absolutely, Sheila will tell you.
Payments key.
There is a lot of interest, absolutely, but there is also beyond the regulatory requirements that are there actually across all of the verticals. But there is these two aspects, which is security and the need to work with banks.
And banks are traditionally not so forward or easy to work with.
Both of those. So not all of them are very forward in terms of wanting to work with smaller companies. And the ones that do often, sort of slow them down because their compliance mindset is not there yet. There is other things. So
at least we're seeing some, you can say, investments and acquisitions happening now. I mean, do you think that's also going to go up?
It will go up, but it will go up where, this fintech or smaller fintech with bank collaboration can work well in all
where
of
you
those
can find
regards.
a bank who you can work with, because working with multiple banks is going to be really, really tough for a startup to do, right?
Actually, anyone who will want to go at it by themselves will find it more difficult to get funded,
Right.
as against someone who will find a bank to work with and build something that leverages both their strength in terms of being nimble, creative, all of those things, and the sort of stability that a bank brings.
Actually very similar to Mithin's insight last week, right? Where when he was talking about his startup, how they told him sell to Cisco or sell to Juniper, and then from there we'll buy.
Yeah.
It's a similar kind of this over here.
No, so that's because payments is that entrenched an industry, right? I mean, it
is entrenched, but it is also those two things that I just said, right? It involves security and just so why do you need a bank, right? Because end of the day there is a clearing and settlement that needs to be done.
Right.
You need an entity that is has the standing to settle a transaction within this ecosystem or payment system, and you can't just allow a small company to participate and expect them to have that standing to be able to honor all of those settlements.
This is an interesting segue into a potential new episode where we talk about blockchain and how that's gonna change things. I mean, I think, but until the world has a blockchain, we still need banks to maintain our ledgers and ensure our money resides with them in some form. So on that note, I think we spoke about some really interesting stuff. I mean, I'm sure.
This is great.
Being a payments geek, I can keep the show going on for a few hours, but I don't want to do that.
That's going to be Shiladitya's new Twitter bio, Payments Geek.
I already have it.
You already have that in your Twitter bio?
Seriously? What do you think?
Oh, okay.
but no. So thanks so much, Abhijeet. I think what you should also, like you said, is the portal which Visa has. Where do devs find that?
So it's accessible at developer.visa.com. Anyone can go and just very basic registration, start looking at our APIs. There's detailed documentation available. There are sandboxes available for you to go and try a few things out.
Has
So
anything interesting
space.
already started which you can talk about? Like any examples out there where you've started to work with smaller companies or startups?
So there are a couple of examples. There is this company called Udio. They're an app for payments. And for their QR-based payments, they actually have integrated into us using our API platform.
Nice.
Okay.
There's another company, you've probably heard about them. They're called Walnut.
Yeah.
They're processing P2P payments, and at the back, although not directly through their processors, they use our APIs to manage.
Yeah. So Walnut does Visa card to Visa card payments.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I did
So
not know that.
I can pay your card from my Visa.
That's good to know. Actually, I can start using that too. I use this for poker settlement. That's
Which is another topic of discussion on its own.
Of course.
The underground network of poker settlements.
And payment technology that can
yes, that can be a
That can help that.
can make it so much easier. Yeah.
So where can we find you if someone wants to reach out? On Twitter, maybe?
On Twitter, it's at Abhijeet Ramesh. I'm on LinkedIn, Abhijeet Ramesh.
Thanks so much for being here, Abhijeet. I mean, thanks so much for talking so much about payments. I loved it.
Thanks for having me over. An absolute pleasure.
Great.
Thanks.
On that note, see you guys next week.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking. Sorry to say, but there's been a slight delay due to the apocalypse having suddenly begun. As you can see, there's death, destruction, and chaos taking place all around us. But don't you worry, food and drinks will be served shortly, and I would recommend checking out
IVM Podcasts.
to catch some of your favorite Indian podcasts. We'll keep you going till this whole thing blows over. Thank you.